艾玛 Emma 是《傲慢与偏见》的作者简奥斯汀 Jane Austen 的另一篇长篇小说。艾玛是个上流社会的富家女，在她的村庄海伯里举足轻重。她善良、热心自负。文章描述了当时英国社会的爱情婚姻。该作品被多次搬上荧幕。
Chapter 4 Frank Churchill. On Christmas Day, the ground was covered with snow. The Woodhouses and John Knightley and his family did not go out to pray in the church. The only visitor at Hartfield was Mr. Knightley. Emma felt more cheerful. She had decided not to tell anyone about Mr. Elton's proposal of marriage. The weather was too bad for Harriet to visit Hartfield, and Emma was pleased. A few days later, the weather had improved. It was not so cold, and most of the snow had disappeared. John Knightley and his family got ready to leave Hartfield and return to their home in London. Mr. Woodhouse wanted Isabella to stay longer, but she had decided to go home. She was never happy when she was apart from her husband and children. That same evening, Mr. Woodhouse received a very polite letter from Mr. Elton. The young man was leaving Highbury for a few weeks. He was going to stay with friends in Bath. Mr. Elton sent Mr. Woodhouse his good wishes, but said nothing about Emma. All that night, Mr. Woodhouse worried about Mr. Elton's journey to Bath. Emma told Harriet the truth about Mr. Elton's feelings the next day. Harriet was very upset. The pretty girl cried and cried, but she did not blame Emma. Harriet blamed herself. Mr. Elton was a gentleman. He could never love her. She knew that now. Emma invited Harriet to stay at Hartfield. She tried to help her friend to forget Mr. Elton. The Westons had been expecting Frank Churchill to visit them at Randalls, but he did not come. Mrs. Churchill was ill again, and Frank could not leave her. "Mrs. Weston is very disappointed," Emma said to Mr. Knightley. "I am sorry too, but Mr. Weston now hopes that his son will come in the spring." "I cannot understand that young man," Mr. Knightley said angrily. The name of Frank Churchill always made Mr. Knightley angry. "He must be very selfish," Mr. Knightley went on. "I know that Mrs. Churchill is a difficult woman, but Frank Churchill could come to Highbury if he wanted to. He has plenty of money and plenty of time. I heard that the young man was on holiday in Weymouth in the summer, so he can leave Enscombe when he wants to. Frank Churchill must do his duty," Mr. Knightley went on, "and that duty is to visit his father and his stepmother, Mrs. Weston. He should tell Mrs. Churchill this." Emma laughed. "Mr. Knightley, you do not understand," she said. "Frank Churchill is dependent on the Churchills. They have given him money and a good education. It is his duty to please them." "It is his duty now to please his father," Mr. Knightley replied. "Frank Churchill has enough time to go on holiday by the sea. He has enough time to write long letters to the Westons. He must find enough time to visit Highbury too." "You want to think badly of Frank Churchill," Emma said. "You have never met him, but you do not like him." "That is not true," Mr. Knightley replied. "I do not want to think badly of him. I am sure that Frank Churchill is a fine young man with very good manners." "Then he will be welcome in Highbury," Emma told her friend. "How excited everyone will be when he comes at last." "I do not care if he comes or not," Mr. Knightley said. "I am not a silly young girl. I have no interest in Mr. Frank Churchill. I refuse to talk about him any more." A few days later, Emma and Harriet were walking together in Highbury. Harriet still wanted to talk about Mr. Elton, and everything in Highbury reminded her of him. Soon they were passing the house where Mrs. Bates and her daughter, Miss Hetty Bates, lived. The two ladies lived in a very small house in the centre of the village. The Bateses had very little money, so they had very few pleasures. They could not buy good wine, fine food, or expensive clothes. They were delighted when visitors called on them, and they were both very fond of Emma. Emma knew that it was her duty to visit the Bateses more often, but she thought that the ladies were very dull. Old Mrs. Bates was very deaf. Miss Bates was always talking about her niece, Jane Fairfax, and reading Jane's latest letter to her visitors. On that morning, Emma was tired of hearing Harriet talk about Mr. Elton, so she said to her young friend, "Perhaps we should call on Mrs. and Miss Bates. Their lives are very dull. It is our duty to make them happier." Miss Bates began talking as soon as her visitors came into the sitting-room. "My dear Miss Woodhouse, my dear Miss Smith, what a pleasure it is to see you in our little house," she cried. "How is dear Mr. Woodhouse? Our dear friend Mrs. Cole has just left. She was talking about Mr. Elton. It is a pity that he has gone to Bath. How we shall all miss him. He has such good manners and such a pleasant smile. Mrs. Cole was kind enough to eat some of my cake," Miss Bates went on. "Do sit down, Miss Woodhouse. Perhaps you and Miss Smith will have some cake too." Emma smiled politely and accepted a piece of cake. Miss Bates soon began talking about her niece, Jane Fairfax. "Yes, our dear Jane is in Bath too. Everyone there admires her. She dances so beautifully, of course, and she is so clever." "Have you had a letter from Miss Fairfax recently?" Emma asked politely. "I hope that she is well." "Thank you, Miss Woodhouse, thank you. Yes, we had a letter from Jane this morning. It is so kind of you to ask about her. Now, where is it? Yes, here it is. It is just a short letter this time. Only 2 pages. "Miss Fairfax has beautiful handwriting," Emma said. "Oh, thank you," replied Miss Bates quickly. "Mother, did you hear that? Miss Woodhouse has given us her opinion about Jane's handwriting. She says that Jane has beautiful handwriting." "Beautiful handwriting," she said again more loudly. "My mother is rather deaf," Miss Bates said with a smile. "I sometimes have to say things more than once. But Mother can always hear what Jane says. Dear Jane speaks so very clearly. It will be delightful to see her again." "Is Miss Fairfax coming here soon?" Emma asked. She was surprised. "She has not been in Highbury for more than 2 years, I think." "You are right, Miss Woodhouse," Miss Bates said happily. "You have remembered the time exactly. Yes, Jane will be here next week." "Next week?" Emma repeated in surprise. "Yes, next week," Miss Bates said with a smile. "It is all in her letter, and she will be staying with us for 3 months. Mother and I are so pleased." "How can Miss Fairfax be away from the Campbells for so long?" Emma asked. "Oh, the Campbells, dear Jane's guardians, are going to Ireland," Miss Bates replied. "Their own daughter, such a plain girl, has married a Mr. Dixon. Mr. and Mrs. Dixon have a house in Ireland. The Dixons are very fond of Jane. They all visited Weymouth together. Mr. Dixon saved Jane before she fell into the sea." Emma was interested, and her clever mind was busy at once. "Why is Jane not going to Ireland?" she thought. Perhaps Mr. Dixon, whose wife is very plain, is too fond of the beautiful Jane Fairfax. Emma wanted to know more. I am surprised that Miss Fairfax is not going to Ireland, she said. Mrs. Dixon is Miss Fairfax's dear friend, I believe. That is true, very true, Miss Bates replied. Mr. and Mrs. Dixon both wanted Jane to go with them, but our dear niece has been ill. Jane caught a cold in November and has not been well since then. If she comes to Highbury, Mother and I can look after her. Jane is always happy here, as you know, Miss Woodhouse. But you must read dear Jane's letter for yourself, said Miss Bates, picking up some pages from a chair. She explains everything so clearly. Emma stood up quickly. I am afraid that we must go now, she said. My father is waiting for us. Thank you so much for telling us about Miss Fairfax. As they walked back to Hartfield, Harriet asked Emma to tell her all about Jane. Why does Jane Fairfax live with the Campbells and not here in Highbury with Mrs. and Miss Bates? Harriet said. It is an interesting story, Emma replied. Jane Bates, Mrs. Bates's younger daughter, married a soldier named Lieutenant Fairfax. He was killed fighting for his country soon after baby Jane was born. Before he died, Lieutenant Fairfax saved the life of Colonel Campbell. Then, when Jane Fairfax was 3 years old, her mother died and Jane became an orphan. The Campbells looked after Jane as well as their own daughter, Emma continued. And when Jane was 9 years old, they became her guardians. The Campbells gave Jane a good home and a good education, and she has lived with them ever since. So, the Campbells are rich, Harriet said. No, they are not, Emma replied. If Jane does not marry, she may have to become a governess. She has had a good education and she is clever. She will do well. Let us talk about someone else, Harriet, Emma said. I am tired of Jane Fairfax. I was hoping that Frank Churchill was coming to Highbury, not Jane. I am far more interested in Frank. Emma did not like Jane Fairfax, but she did not know why. The two girls were the same age,